Hi, I'm Mayor Frank Jackson. You've probably seen media coverage of the growing opioid epidemic in northeastern Ohio. But what you might not know is how many of these tragedies begin with a seemingly innocent prescription for pain medication. That is why we're teaming with the Cuyahoga County Opiate Marketing Task Force to encourage you to know the risk. Go to the website on your screen to learn which pills are opiates and alternative ways of dealing with pain. Which starts as a prescription can end with addiction, so know the risk.
Queen is just my everything.
His smile did it. His smile, his eyes, his knowledge. My landlord, he decided that he wanted me to move based on the fact that I was transgender. Let's just respect people in everyday life for just being human.
Welcome to Community Spotlight. I'm your host, Leah Haslage, and today's Spotlight is on the Legal Aid Society and the Fair Housing Center for Rights and Research, and we'll be discussing housing when it comes to reentry. Our guests are Maria Smith, who's the supervising attorney with Legal Aid Society, and Chris Canary, who is the associate director of the Fair Housing Center for Rights and Research. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you.
Let's start off when it comes to housing and reentry, talking about first the impact that it has on the criminal justice here in America.
So the criminal justice system impacts reentry people's rights to housing. Basically, think of it as a braid. There's three things that really play a part. One is structural racism, institutionalized racism, poverty, and both of those have led to the mass incarceration. So we have lots of people that have been in the criminal justice system that have experienced poverty in our community, and then they're coming back to a community that is impoverished, and we're trying to make sure that their rights are protected and that we can undo this structural racism that's impacting their life and the lives of their families and their children.
Now, kind of with that, explain more what reentry exactly is for people that have been incarcerated, and if there's some numbers, some facts about here in Cleveland and in Ohio.
So yes, so reentry means people that are coming, we use it broadly, it's not just people who've been incarcerated. So it can be people that have some contact with the criminal justice system. So the numbers are actually quite daunting. In the United States, there are 100 million US adults that have had some sort of criminal record. In Ohio, the Ohio Black African American population is 14% of the state, but they're overrepresented in the criminal justice system, and the people that are incarcerated, African Americans represent almost half of the people that are incarcerated by the Ohio Department of Rehabilitations and Corrections. So it's a lot of people. There are 7,500 people from Cuyahoga County that are currently incarcerated, and those numbers mean that about 3,000 people each year are coming back from incarceration. But like we said, we're focusing on those that are physically incarcerated, but reentry involves everyone that's had some contact with the criminal justice system because they've made some kind of criminal record that will impede their ability to get housing.
And Cuyahoga County has among the highest numbers in the state of folks returning home from incarceration. And so, it is really critical as a local issue that we try and address this as a community.
Now, how does having a criminal background impact that individual as well as their families?
So we're going to talk about in the housing context.
Yes.
So basically, the way you can think about it is that there's four types of housing. So there's private housing that you rent directly from a landlord. And then there are three kinds of basic subsidized housing. So one is conventional public housing, And in our county, there's the Cuyahoga Metropolitan Housing Authority and the Parma Public Housing Agency that have conventional public housing. Then there's the voucher program, the Housing Choice Voucher Program, and both of those entities have voucher programs. And then there's the third, which is project-based Section 8 housing. Those three options are the affordable options for people because they're income-based, so that your rent is determined by 30% of your income. So if you're working a low-wage job, it makes it possible for you to have affordable rent if you have subsidized housing. Unfortunately, there's not enough subsidized housing for those who need it.
Right, about 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 people who qualify for it actually receive that assistance.
Wow. And then if they have families, I mean, all that's going to go towards keeping your housing, and then you can't really afford to do anything else.
So when we think about the impact on a family, somebody with a past criminal, even an arrest sometimes, will trip folks up when they're applying for housing. Housing providers are legally allowed to consider someone's criminal history as an element or an aspect of their screening for whether they want to approve or deny an application. But they have to do so in a way that's non-discriminatory. And what can often happen is housing providers will just create a policy that says if you've been evicted or convicted, I've heard this from landlords, if you've been evicted or convicted, we won't rent to you, right? Yeah. That kind of a policy actually has a discriminatory effect. It harms the individual, right, who should be able to get a home somewhere, right, and move forward with their lives. It doesn't take into account how old they were, how long it's been since the conviction. We've run into folks in our work all the time who it might have been 20 or 30 years ago that somebody had a run-in with the law, right? Yeah. And now they've got this record that has followed them. They're trying to move forward. They may have a family. And this still follows them and puts up barriers. Families sometimes have to live separately. So one parent might not live with the other parent and children, and they might have to have expenses then going to both households.
Another financial burden.
Another financial burden, right? Because this landlord won't let the parent with the criminal history move in, when they return home, for example.
Is that part of the reason why homelessness is such an issue in our area?
Yeah, all of it is braided together, and especially for people that are recently released or have just had a criminal conviction, it makes it very hard for them. Being involved in the criminal justice system often means that you've lost your employment and you've lost your housing. So if you're going to get back on your feet, those are the two key things that you need. And if landlords are creating a barrier they're saying, no, you can't get back on your feet, then it leads to this kind of cycle of not having housing or being homeless for periods. Chronic homelessness, in and out of homeless homes, and then the unaffordability also plays into it.
And as a community, if we really want to address the issue of recidivism, repeat offenses, people need to have legitimate avenues available to them to return home and reintegrate into the community. And if we have policies across the board or large-scale policies that are implemented that are closing doors to people left and right, it really limits their ability, even when folks are trying earnestly, to be, responsible, lawful members of society.
So one of the things that Chris was talking about in terms of laws to protect people in terms of discrimination is that because it disparately impacts African Americans, it can be a violation of the Fair Housing Law to have a rule that excludes people based on criminal convictions. That has your criminal conviction may have nothing to do with whether you can afford the property, whether you'll be a good tenant, whether you're a safety risk. And so all of those things can create a violation of the Fair Housing Law. And that's one of the things that the Center for Rights and Fair Housing Center for Rights and Research can help this community understand better.
Now explain to our viewers more what exactly the Fair Housing Act is. What is fair housing?
We get that question a lot because folks will call us and say, I need fair housing, right? And we all do. We all deserve it. Everybody actually is protected by our fair housing laws, everyone in the country. So at the federal level, we have federal, state, and many times local fair housing laws that exist. At the federal level, our Federal Fair Housing Act was passed back in 1968 as part of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, and originally was designed, it came out of the civil rights movement, to prevent identity-based discrimination based on our race, the color of our skin, our religion, our national origin. It's been amended twice since then. We added sex protections, and protection for folks from being discriminated against based on the fact that they have children in their household or a disability. And so that's at the federal level, and we've got, like I said, state and local laws, and many communities have added protections because they see others who are facing unlawful or unfair discrimination, and they say, we want to include you, we want to be welcoming and inclusive. And there are actually communities across the country that have passed legislation to try and address this issue with barriers, to effective reentry in housing barriers in particular. And Seattle is one fine example. They actually have passed legislation that says landlords can only engage in very specific types of screening based on criminal background, because they say, basically, we want families to reunite, we want the community to heal and become whole, and we want to be a welcoming and inclusive place and see that people can return and thrive in our communities, rather than creating more separation and inequality and perpetuating that cycle.
Yeah, the Fair Housing Act is basically like a diamond for our country, and it was passed right after Dr. King was assassinated, and so it was an expression of, yes, this is in a movement that this is the direction that our country needs to move to heal this long history, this long legacy of discrimination. But many people are benefiting by it, and as I mentioned, since 100 million people in the United States have some form of criminal record, it's not just to advantage African Americans, it advantages everyone. And 2 years ago, again on the anniversary of Dr. King's assassination, the Department of Justice and the Department of Housing and Urban Development issued a guidance that was very, very important about explaining exactly why this is discrimination to use criminal background as a barrier to people that are coming back in the community, or people that have some kind of criminal record.
And that guidance really goes a long way in helping address these barriers, both in assisted housing, which Maria was talking about, but also in the private market. So private landlords, they said, still can screen for criminal background, but they have to have a legitimate reason for doing so, and their policy has to be non-discriminatory in nature. And even if a policy is not designed to discriminate, if it has an effect of discriminating based on race, based on any protected class covered by our laws, then it can violate the Fair Housing Act. And so what they've said is that really, as a best practice, housing providers should be looking at a whole person. They should conduct on a case-by-case basis what they refer to as an individualized assessment of an applicant. So instead of saying, do you have a felony, yes or no, on the application, and then making a decision based on a yes or a no answer on that very limited information, they might say, what was the nature of the offense? How old were you at the time? Allow people to present information that lets a housing provider look at them as a whole person and decide, does this even really impact safety? Maybe it was, bad check writing, and there can be a whole host of things that trip people up and that really don't relate in any way to them being a threat to safety or to a risk to the property as being a good neighbor.
What would be considered a legitimate reason for a landlord to not consider? Versus, you said legitimizing, but so viewers have a better understanding what's considered okay and what's not.
So a landlord might want to make sure that a person doesn't have, is in a high risk of damaging property, or is in a high risk of not paying the rent, or is in a high risk of disturbing neighbors. And so basically, by looking at some discrete incident that a person did X number of months or years ago really isn't a good indicator of what kind of tenant they're going to be. Right. And so that's why this guidance says it's a three-step process. It's like throwing a ball back and forth. So the first step is that the person that's saying your rule that says that you're not going to accept people because they have a criminal conviction or some kind of contact with the criminal justice system, you have to articulate why it's a substantial, legitimate reason. So if you can come up with that, then the ball comes back to me, and I get to say to you, well, your practice is. I'm sorry, I think I got the steps wrong. But I get to say first that your rule has a discriminatory effect. and it results in a disparate impact on a racial group or some group that's protected by the Fair Housing Act. Then you get to say, well, I have a legitimate reason for it. And then once you've articulated the legitimate reason, then I get to say, yeah, but you may have a legitimate reason, but there's another practice, there's another way that you can screen that has a less discriminatory effect on people that have some kind of contact with the criminal justice system. And what the guidance suggests is that each landlord should look at an individualized assessment. The other part that's really important in terms of fair housing is a lot of times people have convictions that are really related to some kind of disability. Like you brought up the connection to the criminal justice system. Well, unfortunately, our criminal justice system not only has structural racism, but it's also been the dumping ground for people that have untreated mental illness, right? Yeah. And we've also criminalized substance abuse and addictions, which now we're starting to see really how race-based that was, and when people now have a sensitivity that opiate addictions should be treated as a medical epidemic, not as a crime, right? So all of those things, so if you're looking at people's convictions, like many times people that have had an alcohol problem, they'll have a litany of public intoxication or
urination.
Public urination or some kind of public disturbance. And then they become sober, they go to treatment, and they can't get housing because they've got like 50 misdemeanors saying that they had, basically the misdemeanors are saying you had an alcohol problem. Well, that person's saying, yes, I had an alcohol problem, but I'm sober now. I've gone through treatment. And so the Fair Housing Act should say to providers, you can't discriminate against this person because really that conduct was a result of their mental health problem.
Right, and they could probably show if they had gone through sober living or any kind of...
They're in recovery. That's right. So people who are in recovery are considered protected under our fair housing laws as people with disabilities. And so this is a long-standing policy that people with disabilities, since disability was added as a protected group in 1988, people with disabilities are entitled to a reasonable accommodation of their disability. So it might mean that your normal policy or rule would be to exclude somebody with any criminal conviction relating to, public indecency, for example, right? Now we know that can have other discriminatory effects and could be challenged under this more recent HUD guidance. But historically, somebody might say that relates to my disability, right? I was using at the time I was under the influence and now I'm in recovery. And they would be entitled to ask for that policy to be waived and not be held, that history not be held against them. And so we work with folks on making requests for accommodations all the time, and a whole host of issues, not just relating to criminal activity, any kind of adjustment that somebody might need in housing. And so that's one of the resources. But this new guidance from 2016 really expands the ways in which fair housing law can be useful as a tool, as an advocacy strategy in helping open up housing opportunities to people who have been historically denied.
But just with the misdemeanors, if they were able to get it expunged, would that help them with the housing, with getting through to landlords?
Definitely. Anytime something is sealed, the landlord should no longer consider it. It should be treated as if it never happened. Unfortunately, the sealing process is a less than perfect process, and media has picked up this ball by saying we're going to take things that no longer matter off the internet so that those kinds of things won't prejudice people and just hang with you forever. But like Chris was saying, this whole framework about individualized assessment, it makes so much sense, right? Social media has helped us to see that the implicit bias against African Americans, just to be black means to be like suspect. But people calling the police on people just because they're African American. And so these policies that have this disparate impact, like having these rules saying if you, like some landlords, no contact with any criminal justice system, no arrests, no convictions, whatever, will keep them from being able to even apply, right, for housing. This guidance tells private landlords and subsidized landlords you can't really use that broad stroke to keep people out. For many years, employment law had those kinds of protections. This is a very good step forward for people to protect their housing. And since those two things are linked, like it's almost impossible to maintain employment if you don't have housing, right?
Yeah.
So if you want people to come home, you want people to get a job, you've also got to give them a place to live. So this kind of framework helps us to move forward in reducing recidivism, reuniting families, protecting children. It makes perfect sense.
If someone was a good tenant prior to their conviction, does that help them at all with getting housing when they come out from being incarcerated, or?
Absolutely. All those kinds of things, right? You know, if you've been a past good tenant, if you have someone who can vouch for you, if you've gotten involved in a community group, if you're working and you have an employer who can make a good reference for you, all of those things can be helpful factors to present to a housing provider as part of their screening process. If they are looking at a criminal background, and that's a barrier, you know, it's going to come up if they're screening for it, right? That you can say, yes, but that's not all that I am, right? Look at the full picture of who I am, what I've been doing with my life since, and you know, what my character and personality is, and move forward that way.
In employment, there's been a movement to ban the box. Essentially, this guidance and this kind of framework helps people to have like a ban the box on housing, because there's really, really not very much nexus between someone's criminal conviction and what kind of tenant they can be.
Right. And really, I mean, these policies that look years and years back into people's history, the research out there actually says, you know, anywhere between 3 and 7 years down the line, if somebody hasn't committed the same offense again, they're about as likely to commit that offense as somebody who never did in the first place.
Right.
And so, you know, policies that are looking back decades really do a lot of harm.
Chris, because I know you'll be leaving us soon, can you tell us a little bit about Fair Housing Center for Rights and Research and the services that you provide?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. We're a nonprofit community organization based here in Cleveland. We serve Northeast Ohio, primarily Cuyahoga and Lorain counties, and folks are welcome to contact us for information or assistance if they have questions about their rights under fair housing law or might need help sort of navigating, you know, asking for an accommodation or appealing a denial for housing in the private market. And so, you know, we welcome folks to call us. We also work a lot educating housing providers. And so we've done a lot of work on this specific issue, making sure that landlords understand the potential, even potentially unintended discriminatory effects that a screening policy like this might have. And so we're here as a resource. People can call us for information at 216-361-9240. We're online at thehousingcenter.org.
You also work with policymakers about these issues.
We do, and in fact, you know, I'm very pleased to share that Cuyahoga County is actually now considering a comprehensive human rights ordinance to expand protections in Cuyahoga County.
Oh, wonderful.
So yeah, in employment, housing, and public accommodations. They are not yet considering reentry issues. They're looking to expand rights for folks not to experience discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity, but we hope, certainly as advocates in this arena, that they will consider reentry issues moving forward as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being with us. Maria, you're going to hang tight.
Yes, thank you.
And
Thank
you
you,
hang
Leah.
tight as well. When we return to Community Spotlight, we're going to keep discussing housing when it comes to reentry. So stay tuned.
is wanted everywhere.
Anthony's on my team. No, he's on my team.
But recently, Anthony went with his parents to find a new place to live.
It's already rented.
But housing discrimination is illegal, so Anthony's parents filed a complaint. And now they have a wonderful place to live. If you believe you've been discriminated against in housing because of your race, color, religion, national origin, sex, familial status, or disability,
Call the Housing Center, 216-361-9240. Fair housing is your right. Use it.
Calls me googly eyes.
You know you're beautiful, right? You know that?
Even you are beautiful. I got bullied for wearing glasses. Share if you're against bullying.
We put it out there, just took off. 3 million people have shared this post. Don't let bullies get you down. I stand with you. My whole family's wearing glasses. I wear glasses and I'm proud.
I even have the army on my team.
All the kind comments brought my child joy. I don't feel thank you is enough.
Thanks.
Welcome back to Community Spotlight. I'm your host, Leah Haslage, and today our spotlight is on Legal Aid Society and the Fair Housing Center for Rights and Research, and we're discussing housing when it comes to reentry. With us again is Maria Smith, who is a supervising attorney with Legal Aid Society, and now joining us is Chloe Sudduth, who is a paralegal with Legal Aid. So welcome to the show and welcome back.
Thank you.
Now you're discussing obviously with housing and being, if you were a good tenant prior and all these different things, but there is a specific program or plan called the Tenant Selection Plan Project. So talk to us about this.
Sure. So we tend to think of federally subsidized housing as some of the most available and accessible housing for folks when other options aren't available. And so a group of housing and reentry advocates got together to see to what degree does a criminal conviction form a barrier for folks in trying to access this housing. So a tenant selection plan is basically the written formal criteria that a housing provider is going to use in screening for eligibility for tenancy. And so we got together and we reached out to every Cuyahoga County project-based Section 8 housing provider and requested a copy of their tenant selection plan. So from this, we gathered 108 tenant selection plans from local providers. And for those that didn't return current TSPs to us, we actually used ones we had collected in previous years. So we had a total of 142 TSPs. And so the group got together and developed a system and a coding scheme to analyze these tenant selection plans to see are criminal convictions forming a barrier for folks. And so we had each tenant selection plan read by two unique individuals, and then they analyzed it, coded it, and built into this data system, and then any discrepancies that were revealed between a tenant selection plan were reconciled by the two folks that read it. And largely we were looking for what is the criteria that housing providers are using when it comes to criminal convictions, and what are the look-back periods, and what type of barrier does this create for folks in trying to access this housing.
And what were some of these key findings?
Yeah, so a number of things that we found, one of which was how largely arbitrary and inconsistent plans were from one to another. So for instance, some tenant selection plans would ban folks for life for having a misdemeanor, while others would not mention misdemeanors at all. Additionally, some would treat a misdemeanor more severely than a felony, with a 10-year look-back period for a misdemeanor versus a 2-year look-back period for a felony. So this difference in criteria used and the breadth of look-back periods kind of speaks to the arbitrary nature of this criteria in screening for tenancy. Additionally, we found that there can be some vague criteria that's used. So over 50% of properties have the right to, and state in their tenant selection plan, that they can deny tenancy for folks that they believe pose a threat to health and safety of property and others. So given how vague that criteria is, it leaves a lot of discretion on the part of property managers to decide who gets tenancy and who doesn't on largely unclear grounds. And the third...
I'm sorry, but because there's no rule or law saying this is what you should be judging based off of, and this isn't, right?
So these are properties that are guided by HUD rules, and the HUD guidance, HUD handbook says that there should be, their rules should be reasonable. So if they're going to have a time period from the date of conviction, it should be reasonable. And so that's a really, really kind of broad stroke, right, on what's reasonable. So we were trying to look at really how broad is it, and how many convictions will disqualify a person for particular housing.
And that's why the vagueness.
Right.
Yeah.
And so this kind of catch-all creates this huge loophole, so that if it's, and I believe it also says like public peaceful enjoyment of the property. So peaceful enjoyment of property, that could be, again, like someone that has a series of public intoxications, or they have loud music convictions because they were driving down the street with their car and their music was blasting when they were 19. Now they're 27 and they want to get, project-based Section 8 housing, and this is going to keep them out. So, yeah, the rules we're looking at, this very, very broad.
Right. Yeah. And when you look from one TSP to the next, the differences in criteria used, I think, speaks to the arbitrary nature, because if one tenant selection plan is going to look at something very seriously and explicitly and discreetly, but another doesn't mention it or mentions it in totally different context or in a different breadth of look-back years, I think that really sheds light on how arbitrary these distinctions are in determining eligibility for tenancy.
Wow. You're starting to say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, the third finding.
Yeah, so the other thing that we found was the devastating consequence of a misdemeanor. So nearly 85% of properties can ban folks with a misdemeanor for anywhere from 3 years up to a lifetime ban.
Wow.
Also, with the exception of traffic offenses, tenant selection plans don't typically distinguish between a misdemeanor and a minor misdemeanor, which has grave consequences, because a minor misdemeanor, you do not have the right to counsel.
Oh. Right. So, and the difference between minor misdemeanor and misdemeanor, many times for applicants, it's lost on them. They just know they have a conviction. They don't realize that there really should be a distinction between a misdemeanor and a minor misdemeanor.
What is the difference? Because I don't know what the difference is.
That you don't have the right to counsel. So if you have a minor misdemeanor and you're convicted of it, the court can't lock you up, right? Because you're not going to have the right to counsel. You're going to have some kind of fine or something like that, but you're not going to serve jail time.
So this could be drugs, this could be traffic, this could be anything of that nature?
Yeah, it could be like riding the RTA without the bus fares. And there's like all kinds of little minor misdemeanors that you could be charged with.
And then that can keep you from housing?
We think it should not keep you from housing. But I think that given that these plans don't make the distinction, probably there are a lot of property managers that are looking at the convictions without understanding the distinction, and they're just lumping everybody together like it's a conviction. So we're hoping that people will realize that a misdemeanor should be treated like it was originally intended, as something that's a relatively minor infraction, and it should not linger with you for the rest of your life and keep you from very fundamental things that you need, like employment and housing.
Wow. What other key findings were there from this research?
So those were the big ones. I think the big takeaway points for us were, again, that you can look from one tenant selection plan to the next, and there's large differences in what criteria is used and how it's applied, and also that we are not sure if necessarily if these are being applied universally across.
So the important thing for people that are applying for project-based Section 8 housing to know, if they get this denial, that shouldn't be the final word. We're really encouraging people to assert their rights to ask for an appeal. And what we encourage people to do is to read thoroughly the letter that you've received, which many times you get something, you get the gist that that you're being denied, and then you really don't want to read the rest of it. But read thoroughly the letter, figure out how much time you have to ask for a review, and then make sure that you go back to that property and ask in writing for the information that was used to deny your application, because it may be that they used someone else's information, right? Mm-hmm. The information that was used, a copy of your application, right, and a copy of their tenant selection plan. So you want to make sure that they're actually following their own rule, that they're not just excluding you because someone looked at some report that was done by a third-party company that said you have a criminal conviction and you have no idea whether that's actually you or not. We've had cases where people have actually gotten the criminal report that was used, and then they can see specifically that the person that's referred to in the report is someone that has either like a similar birthday or the same name, but it's not the same person. So it's really important to know what was the information that was used to deny the person, and it's really important to know what was the tenant selection plan, what was the criteria that was used.
What was the biggest surprise to each of you when you went through this research and these findings?
I think for me it was that some of the plans had such long look-back periods for misdemeanor convictions, and the fact that some plans could hold it against a possible tenant longer for a misdemeanor than for a felony. To me, that seems counterintuitive.
Right.
So that was really a jarring finding for me.
Yeah, the same. I think that many times criminal defense attorneys, they think that they're helping their clients because they're getting something reduced to a misdemeanor, and people are taking it thinking that somehow that, now I can move on with my life. It's not a felony because a felony would be very severe. It'd keep me from all kinds of things. And here we're looking at this project-based Section 8 housing, which should be affordable based on your income, and then this misdemeanor is a barrier for a long period of time. So we want everyone, courts and defense counsel and the public, to know that this misdemeanor needs to be put in its place. It really should not keep people from housing.
Anything else you think people should know about housing when it comes to reentry?
Well, what we really want people to know is that your criminal conviction should not keep you from getting housing that you can afford. And we want landlords to decide that they're going to look at people for who they are when they're applying and their ability to pay, and not look at everything that happened before, because it doesn't allow people to move on.
Well, ladies, thank you so much. How can we get more information on housing, reentry, and Legal Aid Society?
You can contact the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland at 216-687-1900, or come to our website. I think it's lascleve.org.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, very good. Thank you so much, Maria and Chloe. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I know I've learned a lot today, and I'm sure our viewers have as well. And of course, don't forget to check out our blog at tv20cleveland.com for more information and to get this website info. From Community Spotlight and TV20, I'm Leah Hasledge. Until next time.
We can't have a true democracy unless all segments of our society have access to justice.
Regardless of religious or social justice perspectives, I think that everybody agrees on one principle, which is that regardless of wherewithal to pay, people are entitled to justice.
You start to deal with the fundamental issues of housing and safety and education, and suddenly you have people who are employable, and it levels the playing field by dealing with those legal issues for people who wouldn't otherwise have anywhere else to go.
We all have legal rights. The role we fill is to help individuals utilize their legal rights.
I don't think the community really realizes how many people cannot afford legal services, yet they are affected by the legal system.
Sometimes people ask me, how's work going? Is it busy? And really the answer for legal aid is there will always be more demand than we can serve.
We get to learn really what's happening, what people are facing, how the economic conditions impact everybody in our city.
Legal aid is important to United Way and other funders because we have consumers who are in need of housing, and it doesn't make sense for people who currently have housing to lose it when we have a resource like the Legal Aid Society who can assist people who are being threatened with eviction or foreclosure.
My husband he was working and I've been retired. You know, work got slow and we got behind in our house payments. And we tried to work things out with the bank, and of course they didn't want to hear tell of it. If we didn't have legal aid, we would have foreclosed on our home.
Single dad, depending on the system for welfare and lifeline support. My older son had got a job, was going to move out and get going, and he then moved back in, and I was being accused of not reporting him being in or out. I thought I was doing the right thing, and I was happy for him to get a job, and then it just all snowballed and they were charging me with welfare fraud.
Receiving public benefits is a complicated matter, even for the workers and the agencies that administer the programs, and so it's considered to be highly specialized.
He was awesome from the first phone call. He just picked me up from there, as far as my spirit. And in the end, he saved the day and inspired us to restart.
It gives you such great satisfaction to help somebody. And that's what's kept me here all these years, being able to make people whole again.
I've had a long personal relationship with the Legal Aid Society. People who otherwise would not be able to cope with the system. They give them an opportunity to know when they walk into court that they have quality representation, that they're equal before the law.
What we're talking about here are basic human rights: shelter, safety, health care. The people that come to legal aid for assistance have those basic human needs at risk.
The power of legal aid is it removes the issue. It allows you to see your life in a different place, in a different way, and allows you to make some changes in your life. And through those changes, you're suddenly empowered to find a way to be a different member of your community.
Cody is my nephew. It started off with Cody's always late to class, Cody isn't completing his homework, Cody's goofing off. He was facing expulsion, and I didn't know there were laws in place to assist a child like Cody. Legal Aid went with us to the expulsion hearing. She then filed a motion saying that he had been denied his rights as a student, that this is a child who has special education needs. Had it not been for legal aid, not only educating me, but also educating Cody, he could have well been a statistic. All of my hard work, crying, screaming, going crazy paid off, and he graduated.
The goal is to allow people to be independent, productive members of society, allow people to work through their existing issues and troubles and to get back on their feet and to be able to stand on their own.
I came to legal aid in about '95. I was a single mom, or soon-to-be single mom with 2 children. My kids and I were at risk, and we needed help finding a way out. When I walked into legal aid that day, I was terrified, and I felt trapped. And what I got out of legal aid was a sense of empowerment and a sense of hope. I often speak of my experience at legal aid as a pivot point. It was the first time in my life where I really felt like somebody was pushing me to be a better me, and could see that there was something underneath all of the issues in my life that could be used for good. I knew that someday after law school, no matter where I ended up working, that I wanted to be involved with this agency. And it was finally showing my kids that you can set a goal, and regardless of where you start, you can end up in a very different place.
We measure the success of our work. We look at not only the legal outcomes, but also the financial impact our work has on the community. To the extent we have more resources, we can make a bigger difference in the lives of more people.
This is an organization where you can see what your money does, and where the results of your donations are walking around in the community, and where the results of your donations will in turn lead to a community that's a better Cleveland.